Violence needs a burden, needs a purpose.
David Cronenberg is a Canadian filmmaker from Toronto, Ontario, who has gained a huge international following. His influence on Canadian film culture is huge because he diverged away from the norms within domestic film and explored a visceral and shocking side of filmmaking in a new and psychologically complex way. His most popular works include The Fly, Videodrome, Naked Lunch, and The Dead Zone. Cronenberg is recognized as being one of the key figures in the development of the body horror subgenre, making this contribution through some of his earlier work including Shivers, Rabid, and The Fly. Consistently throughout his career, he has explored themes of self-identity,
that's not too terrible, is it? Most people would give anything to be turned into something else.
Technology, sexuality, and the flesh.
I haven't taught the computer to be made crazy by the flesh.
Two of his most well-known works, which focus heavily on these themes, are his 1983 film Videodrome and his 1986 remake of The Fly. I'll be exploring these two films in relation to the auteur theory, which is a term and concept popularized in North America by the critic Auteur. Serris wrote an article on the subject in 1962 titled Notes on the Auteur Theory, which was inspired by several French articles, predominantly a 1954 essay in the Cahiers du Cinéma titled A Certain Tendency of the French Cinema, written by 23-year-old critic and soon-to-be filmmaker François Truffaut. The thoughts expressed by Truffaut and by other critics in the post-World War II Cine Club movement were brought on by the lifting of the ban on American films during the war. Post-liberation, French cinephiles could essentially binge-watch American films, giving them the ability to see connections across the bodies of work done by American directors. This new perspective gave critics like Truffaut a desire to break away from the formulaic style of filmmaking that had become popular in France. A style that stuck to formulas that prioritized success at festivals over artistry. In A Certain Tendency of French Cinema, Truffaut commends filmmaker Claude Autant for his nonconformity, advanced ideas, and wild anti-clericalism. He implores his readers to recognize Claude for the virtue of always remaining in his films honest with himself. Serris outlines three criteria which exist in a concentric circle: technical proficiency, personal style, and interior meaning. A director must obtain all three in order to be considered an auteur. I'll also be looking at critic Pauline Kael's response to Serris in her article Circles and Squares, published in 1963. Kael stresses that it takes an extraordinary intelligence, discrimination, and taste to use any theory in the arts. She felt that auteur critics were applying criticism through a rigid formula instead of through educated observations. The first element in Serris's circle, technical proficiency, is exactly what it sounds like. Serris states that a great director has to be at least a good director. A good director must at least be able to run a set. It could be hard to tell if a film's technical qualities are the result of a talented crew covering for a quasi-chimpanzee director, as Serris puts it. So how do you distinguish between the quasi-chimpanzee and the technically proficient director? Serris states that there's a pattern established through a repetition across a filmmaker's body of work. A repeatability in each of the three circles is a strong factor at play in whether or not someone is deemed an auteur. Renoir's observation that a director spends his life on variations of the same film is a good summation of this. In response to the first circle, Kael points out that this restrictive mentality around what is proper can do nothing but scare new filmmakers into using the same old mold as everyone else instead of developing a unique method that is truer to them. I think that both are right in a way. If you're working on a set, you need to be able to work within the tried and true methods that everybody has been trained in, but if you're working independently from a studio, developing your own techniques and integrating them into your professional work if they're effective is also something that filmmakers should feel encouraged to do, because without innovation, there's only stagnation. The second element relates to the personal flair that the director brings to the screen, or the relationship between a film's aesthetic and the thoughts and feelings of the director. This could be Tim Burton's consistent use of German expressionist motifs, or David Lynch's juxtaposition between a sunny Norman Rockwell-esque mise-en-scène and darker, more sinister visuals. Kael believes that the artistic value of a film shouldn't be judged on how distinctly the director's personal style shines through. She expresses this perfectly by saying, "The smell of a skunk is more distinguishable than the perfume of a rose. Does that make it better?" This is a good point. There are skunk directors, but there are also cinnamon roll directors. You can smell both from blocks away, but one is clearly more welcome. Additionally, a good director can recognize when the story calls for something not cinnamon roll, as Cronenberg did with A Dangerous Method. The third and most important element is interior meaning. This element is the hardest to define, and it is also the one that is the most disputed. Serris writes that the interior meaning is extrapolated from the tension between a director's personality and his material. Serris believes that it can only be displayed through cinema and is not tangible enough to be described in words. It's nothing more than a beat's hesitation in the rhythm of a film. Serris uses the example of a moment in Le Relais de Joux where Renoir gallops up the stairs, turns to his right with a lurching movement, stops in hop-like uncertainty when his name is called by a coquettish maid, then with the marvelous post-reflex continuity, resumes his bearishly shambling journey to the heroine's boudoir. He couldn't put a finger on the musical grace note of that momentary suspension, but if he were to name it, he'd call it an elan, or energy, of the soul of the director. Pauline Kael believes that it's insane for the final tier to be dependent on the director clashing with the script. She states that this is counterintuitive to the commonly accepted idea that an artist expresses himself in the unity of form and content. This means that the pinnacle of Kino is scraped out of dumpster-fire commercial projects that were a nightmare to work on, but at least if the director can just sprinkle some personality all over it, then it's a masterpiece. Supposedly, the key to making your name as an auteur is to take on a contract for 10 years of Hallmark Christmas movies and begrudgingly insert your deeper meaning, one musical grace note of momentary suspension at a time. In the book 50 Contemporary Filmmakers, Yvonne Tasker states Besson to be a true auteur in the earliest sense of the term, because of his major presence throughout the entire filmmaking process. He's a master of visual style. His style is distinctively his own. He takes astonishing risks. He refuses to accept easy solutions in either cinematography or mise-en-scène. And he either writes or co-writes his films from original concepts. There's a problem here. Kael draws attention to it by asking, why doesn't he, Serris, just come out and admit that the writer-directors are disqualified by his third premise? They can't arrive at that interior meaning, the ultimate glory of the cinema, because a writer-director has no tension between his personality and his material, so there's nothing for the auteur critic to extrapolate from. This disqualifies a large chunk of Serris' list of the top 20 auteurs. And it also disqualifies many contemporary filmmakers, including but not limited to Quentin Tarantino, Wes Anderson, Stanley Kubrick, Martin Scorsese, Paul Thomas Anderson, Francis Ford Coppola, David Lynch, Spike Lee, Joel and Ethan Coen, John Carpenter, Richard Linklater, Guillermo del Toro, Andrei Tarkovsky, Robert Rodriguez, and David Cronenberg. Kael said that it's amusing and or depressing to see the way auteur critics tend to downgrade writer-directors who are in the best position to use the film medium for personal expression. I completely agree. It's an outdated idea established in anti-screenwriter sentiments from a time in France when critics like Truffaut were growing tired of the tradition of quality, which was kept alive by writers who were completely underestimating the capacity of film. A tradition based in repetitive formula that plagued the cinema landscape. They were tired of seeing films that valued festival recognition over artistic integrity. Kael was overall worried that auteur theory was dangerous because it dumbed down film criticism and was bound to leave young and ambitious filmmakers with the impression that they must focus their interest commercially. But according to Serris, auteur theory was only intended as an efficient means of classifying cinema, and said that it was never meant to be a cult ritual. It must be remembered that research and analysis are the most important elements of film criticism. So, is Cronenberg an auteur? In The Fly and Videodrome, Cronenberg's aptitude for special effects is apparent. He approaches his content in a visceral and in-your-face way that many filmmakers would be afraid to. Take for example the horrifying transformation of Seth Brundle into Brundlefly, the gun becoming a part of Max Rein's hand, all of the hallucinatory visions in Videodrome, and the convincing technological contraptions such as the telepods in The Fly. Cronenberg's personal style is displayed fluidly across his work as well. Yvonne Tasker calls to light a consistency between the early and later works, and that there's an intellectual and experimental element to his earlier works that is most commonly attributed to his later works, and there's a bodily gross-out factor in his later works that's most commonly attributed to his earlier works. He believes that you can't press Cronenberg's work into perfect auteurist coherence, but there's a strong consistency and continuity across his body of work. The body horror aspect that Cronenberg is best known for is especially present in The Fly and Videodrome. This style is signaturely Cronenberg, since he was one of the key influencers in the innovation and popularization of it within the horror genre. Yvonne sees a clinical gaze, one that is analogous to scientific method, across Cronenberg's work, and refers to Cronenberg as being, in a sense, a scientist-artist. One of the most unique aspects of Cronenberg's work is the subtext that can be found in work that superficially presents itself as nothing more than gory horror. His most popular film, The Fly, features Jeff Goldblum as a quirky scientist and Gina Davis as a science journalist. It is the love story that develops between the two characters that makes the horrifying conclusion of the film so tragic. The humanity of Goldblum's character, Seth Brundle, even after he's far into his transition into Brundlefly, creates a relatability for the audience that was lost in the original version from 1958. He retains his human eyes, voice, and character for most of the film, and these are only lost come the finale. The heartbreaking tale of love that is cut short by Brundle's transformation, which could be interpreted as a metaphor for AIDS, and concludes with a mercy killing committed by his lover, Ronnie, is, as Cronenberg has said, not a prescription for a commercial movie, and the only way that a story with a deeper meaning like this could be accepted was under the guise of the horror genre's overt themes of aging, disease, invasion, decay, and death. Robin Wood saw a consistency across Cronenberg's work in the formula constructed from the mad scientist trope, where a quirky scientist comes across something which he sees to have great potential.
I'm working on something that'll change the world and human life as we know it,
but which inevitably results in disaster and often the death of this protagonist. Dr. Christine Ramsey saw the trademarks of the deeper meanings within Cronenberg's films as being the recurring themes of the misguided scientist and his fragile masculinity, corporate greed and corruption, technology's interface with the body, mental and physical states, sexual paranoia, melancholia, and the stylistic embrace of modernism, surrealism, and brutalism. Most of these are found in Videodrome. The cautionary stance taken on the dangers of television were described as being dated by Yvonne, but I believe this theme continues to be more relevant than ever as the internet and the dark potential of this interactive online space presents itself as a new frontier of moral quandary. Cronenberg is also, as previously stated, both an auteur and author, and he's been able to have a great amount of control over his material throughout his career. So yes, Cronenberg is undoubtedly an auteur. He learned filmmaking from the ground up and has been technically proficient since the start of his career. There's a consistency and personal style throughout his work, and his films are representative of much more than what initially meets the eye. This has been David Cronenberg and the Auteur Theory. Thank you for watching, and have a good night.